Behavioural explanations of phobias. For this part of the specification, you need to be aware about the two-process model. So that is classical and operant conditioning. So how classical and operant conditioning will explain the development of phobias. So the two-process model was developed by Maurer that assumes that we have learnt our phobia through an interaction with our environment. So phobias are learnt in the first place through classical conditioning, but they are maintained through operant conditioning. So we're going to look at those in a bit more detail. So classical conditioning is learning through association. So we have associated something that we did not originally fear, so the neutral stimulus, with a fearful, traumatic stimulus situation. So for example, the neutral stimulus of a dog is paired with being bitten, so the unconditioned stimulus. So you were bit by a dog, which causes you to be upset and fearful, so the unconditioned response. That pairing causes you to associate the dog with being bitten and being frightened, upset, fearful. That dog, or dogs in general, generalized, has become the conditioned stimulus and causes a conditioned response of fear. So a phobia of dogs has been developed. Operant conditioning is when phobias can be negatively reinforced. So the behavior is strengthened because the unpleasant stimulus has been removed. So for example, people might avoid going to places where you might see a dog, so for example parks, or going around their friends if they know that they have a dog that lives there. That reduces any feelings of anxiety or fear that they might have, which negatively reinforces the person's avoidance behaviour, making the person more likely to repeat the avoidance behaviour, so avoiding situations where they'll encounter a dog, therefore the phobia is maintained. Now it's really important that when you describe classical and operant conditioning that you do so in relation to phobias and do not talk about Pavlov and Skinner in this situation. You might get a question that is like this. Kirsty is in her 20s and has a phobia of balloons since one burst near her face when she was a little girl. Loud noises such as banging and popping causes Kirsty extreme anxiety, and she avoids situations such as birthday parties and weddings where there might be balloons. Suggest how the behavioural approach might explain Kirsty's phobia to balloons. So you're going to talk about classical and operant conditioning in this situation. So Kirsty's phobia has developed through classical conditioning. She has formed an association between the balloon, which was the neutral stimulus in this situation, with a feared response. So she got frightened with the loud noise. So the balloon was the neutral stimulus, that's been paired with the loud noise, which was the unconditioned stimulus, which caused the unconditioned response of fear. Due to that pairing, she now associates balloons, popping noises, or seeing a balloon with that fearful situation, that event. So she's generalised it to certain situations. Also, she has operant conditioning where her phobia is maintained through negative reinforcement. So she avoids situations where she might encounter balloons, which reduces her feelings of anxiety. Therefore, she has maintained the phobia of balloons. In terms of evaluation, so we have some supporting evidence. So that is the study of little Albert. So this was Watson and Rayner's study where they took an infant who did not have a phobia of rats. So the rat was the neutral stimulus. Little Albert showed curiosity towards the rat when he was first introduced. Every time that little Albert was presented with the rat, Watson banged a steel rod behind his head, which caused a loud noise. Now that is the unconditioned stimulus, which caused little Albert to get very upset and frightened, the unconditioned response. Now with enough pairings of the neutral stimulus of the rat and the loud noise, little Albert developed a phobia of the rat. So the rat had become the conditioned stimulus, in which causing him to have the conditioned response of anxiety, fearfulness, distress. So he developed a phobia of rats. Now, he also generalized that phobia to anything that was white and fluffy. So for example, the rabbit, a mask that had of Santa, so it had a white beard, a white fur coat. So he generalized that phobia to other situations, which supports the idea that we can learn phobias through classical conditioning. However, we have contradictory evidence. So not everyone that has a phobia of dogs had actually had a bad experience with dogs. So there was no situation in which they'd had a stimulus and response to the dog. So there is no way that they have been classically conditioned to have a phobia of dogs. If we were to compare it to another approach or to look at other situations, it is quite reductionist and oversimplistic. It ignores the role of cognition, so our thinking about phobias, and cognitive approach would suggest that phobias could develop as a result of irrational thinking. So linking to the ABC model, there was an activating event that caused you to have an irrational belief. So being bitten by a dog was the event, which then caused the irrational belief that all dogs are scary and they are going to attack you, which leads to the negative consequence of having a phobia. However, it is useful. It has led to many different treatments into phobias, so for example, systematic desensitization and flooding. And these are effective, so in order for them to be effective, it means that they must be based on an explanation that is valid, which strengthens the claims that we can learn a phobia if we are able to unlearn them at a later date. You may get a 16 marker that is discuss the behavioural approach in explaining phobias. In this situation, you remember that discuss is outline and evaluate or describe and evaluate, so you have to include evaluation in this 16 marker. Remember, the essay should be majority in terms of evaluation, 6 key points on your AO1, so sort of 2 paragraphs on what classical conditioning is, giving clear examples of a phobia to support your claims. So an example of what would be a neutral stimulus, what would be an unconditioned stimulus, what would be the unconditioned response, what would eventually become the conditioned stimulus that causes the conditioned response. That really demonstrates to the examiner that you know your stuff if you are able to apply that information and give examples. Then operant conditioning, how is that phobia maintained? Why is it being a negatively reinforcer or reinforcement happening? Then you'd move on to your evaluation, so 3 to 4 peel paragraphs if you can try to get any issues and debates in there, such as it being reductionist and oversimplistic, and comparing it to other approaches, then that would be amazing.